We often hear evolutionists claim that there is overwhelming evidence for biological evolution. However, this claim does not stand up to close objective scrutiny. Most of what evolutionists claim as evidence for biological evolution is actually interpretation of evidence based on evolution. This means that evolutionists assume evolution when interpreting evidence, and then claim that interpretation has evidence for evolution. This is called circular reasoning, which is a logical fallacy. Biological evolution is always presented as the only scientific explanation for the past and present life on Earth, even when the evidence is so fragmented as to be laughable. We will take a look at some of this alleged evidence and show that not only is it not evidence for evolution, but that it also fits biblical creation. The essence of biological evolution is the universal descent of all life on Earth from a single common ancestor. All of the variety in life is thought to have originated by way of random mutations filtered through natural selection. However, natural selection is too broad of a filter to produce the new specific information needed to go from single-celled organism to man. Now, small changes are observed in organisms over time, but they are insufficient to accumulate into the large-scale changes needed for evolution, as evolutionists often claim. Evolution requires lots of new information to be created, but these observed changes result from turning on and off and rearranging existing information or a loss of information. As such, if they accumulate, they will produce a large amount of information loss, resulting in large-scale change in the wrong direction for evolution. Evolutionists like pointing to the tree of life, which shows various types of organisms, including man, connected to every other organism through a complex set of branches to the origin of life. However, the lines connecting these organisms exist only in the minds of evolutionists. When you take away these evolutionary presuppositions, all you have are a group of organisms arranged according to some similarities. Evolution is fundamentally atheistic in nature. Not only does it leave no place for God, but any attempt to add him or suggest any intelligence behind the process is meant with contempt. This is because the entire purpose of biological evolution is to try to explain our existence apart from God, which is why compromises, such as theistic evolution, are pointless. It is also why believing in evolution tends to lead people to atheism. Evolution, however, is more than atheistic, but is totally anti-theistic, as is shown by the reaction of its proponents to any suggestion of God or intelligent design. Phylogenetic trees are projections of the alleged evolutionary relationship between organisms. They are based on comparing one or more traits for similarities and differences. Note, as shown here, that all of the organisms are on the tips of the branches and not any place else. These phylogenetic trees are often used as evidence for evolution. However, the exact tree that results often varies with what is being compared. That is, you can take the same organisms, plug in different traits, and get different results. Here is an example from the anti-creationist website, Talk Origins. This compares a morphological tree and molecular tree. Now, while most of the organisms are in the same place, Gavia Alice is not in the same place or even close in both trees. Here is yet another example from ResearchGate where different traits are compared, resulting in different polygenic trees. This is a very common occurrence. Note that you can get the polygenic tree that you want by cherry-picking the traits that are compared. It gets even worse because it has been shown that if you put in random data, you still get a polygenic tree because that is how the program is written. The next slide is the final nail in this piece of evolutionary propaganda. Here are two polygenic trees produced by comparing a rivet, a nail, a screw, and a bolt. As with living things, you get different polygenic trees, depending upon which traits you compare. And we know that none of these fasteners descended had a common ancestor with each other, but they were designed for similar purposes. Fossils are the remains of once living organisms found buried in rock. There are three main types of fossils: mineralized remains, filled casts, and imprints. Here is an imprint fossil of some ferns. Evolutionists date fossils largely by the rock layers of what they call the geologic timescale that they're found in. Sometimes radiometric dating is used, but it is only seen as valid if it agrees with the geologic timescale. It ignores the fact that fossils are often found out of place according to this geologic timescale. This includes cases like the Ashley phosphate beds in Charleston, South Carolina, where they are all mixed together in the same layer of rock. They include fossil bones of man with dinosaurs, plesiosaurs, whales, sharks, rhinos, horses, mastodons, mammoths, porpoises, elephants, deer, pigs, dogs, and sheep, all in a 40-square-mile area. Evolutionists tend to ignore it, but when forced to acknowledge it, they assume some form of reworking occurred without any evidence. Fossils such as this one show a fish killed and fossilized in the act of eating another fish. Such fossil action shots show sudden catastrophic death and burial, as would be expected by the Genesis flood, and not gradual burial over time. Here is a chart of dinosaur fossils showing the alleged family tree. These dotted lines are the inferred relationships between various types of dinosaurs. They are not the result of anything actually found in the fossil record, but are the results of the imaginations of evolutionists interpreting what they think the relationships would be. These light purple lines are missing ancestral lineages. That means there is no evidence that they ever existed. They're just required for evolution to work. These vertical dashed lines are temporal range extensions based on fragmented evidence. They are actually the most scientific part of the additions to this chart. These are the ranges of the fossils actually found. That is the actual evidence. To strip away the evolutionary assumptions and the extrapolation needed to make evolution work. This is how the real evidence actually looks like, just a bunch of animals found in the ground. Some fossils were first known from fossils before they were found alive. They're called living fossils. One example, the coelacanth, was thought to be extinct for over 100 million years until it was found alive and well in the Indian Ocean. This is expected if fossils were a result of the Genesis flood, but not by evolutionary uniformitarian models. Ultimately, the fossil record does not support evolution. The alleged evidence for evolution from the fossil record consists mainly of fossils filled in with evolutionary assumptions and guesswork. Most of the problems creationists have had in dealing with the fossil record comes from trying to explain evolutionary assumptions in terms of the Genesis flood instead of what is actually there. Transitional forms of fossils are claimed to be transitional between different types of organisms. This is based entirely on the appearance of the organism and the assumption of evolution. Often, the order is not what evolution says it should be, and other times, they're labeled as related but not direct ancestors because they don't fit evolution well enough. Often, they will create a transitional form from fragments of remains. Ampulocetus, an alleged transition to whales, is a good example. The original fossil had no upper front leg, and so the lower front leg was turned into a transitional fin. When better fossils were found, they showed normal land-dwelling front and back legs. Rhodocytos is another example. In this case, no limbs and a partial tail were found. Evolutionists constructed this as a dolphin with small rear legs and front fins. Since then, more complete fossils have been found showing them to be land animals, powerful swimmers but land animals. Myosotis, their next transitional whale, also shows signs of being a land animal, at least part-time. The discovery of a pregnant female shows they gave birth on land and not at sea. Basilosaurus, their next transitional whale, was fully aquatic with small back limbs that aided reproduction. Not only is there no evidence of a transition from land mammals here, but Basilosaurus was more eel-like than whale-like. These all show how much evolutionary presuppositions influence the reconstruction of fossils. It is actually quite easy to make a transitional series based only on appearance, even if there is clearly no relationship. What follows is just such a transitional series. Here is a transitional series from a fork to a spoon, with the transitional type being the spork. And this is pretty much the way evolutionists determine transitional forms. According to evolutionists, humans had a common ancestor with chimpanzees 5 to 7 million years ago. Among the evidence they claim for this theory is that human and chimpanzee DNA is 98.77% similar, which is sometimes rounded down to 98 or up to 99%. What they don't tell you is that to get the 98.77% figure, they actually have to ignore a significant portion of both genomes. What they do is enter a segment of one genome into a computer program that finds the segment most easily aligned with it in the other. They then only count the substitutions, which are places where one nucleotide is swapped for another, and not indels, which are one or more nucleotides are found in one and not the other. When the indels are added, there is an additional 3% worth of differences, resulting in a similarity of 95.89% in these easily aligned sections. When all of both genomes are included, the actual percent similarity between human and chimpanzee genomes is 67.1%, which is a far cry from the 98.89% similarity quoted by evolutionists. The 32.9% actual difference totally destroys the notion that humans and chimpanzees had a common ancestor. Most of the alleged evidence for human evolution comes from fossils that they claim to be different species of humans. However, a close look shows these are just varieties that occurred in mankind during the post-Babel dispersion. The biggest problem are the differences in mitochondrial DNA, but evolutionists usually assume constant rates. This is a reasonable assumption when dealing with a large population size, such as over 100,000, since such populations tend to average out extremes. However, the extremes could have been the norm in some small, isolated groups during the post-Babel dispersion. The grouping and other genetic factors are also consistent with small, isolated groups rather than large populations. Even at a nuclear DNA mutation rate of 50 mutations per generation, only 4 generations would be required to get 200 differences and 8 to get 400. That's only 150 to 300 years. In any event, they are close enough to living humans to be fully human. For example, there is more genetic variety among dogs. However, it also needs to be considered that even from a creationist perspective, this DNA is still about 4,000 years old. The fact is that this DNA is highly degraded and needed to be reconstructed, a process that would be error-prone. That is probably the main cause of these differences in mitochondrial DNA. The fossil known as Lucy is a specimen of Australopithecus afarensis. At the time of its discovery, it was the most complete Australopithecus skeleton ever found, but still only about 40% complete. Australopithecus means southern ape. The literally footprints are a trail of 2 sets of footprints, one from an adult and one from a child. Because these clearly human footprints are dated to 3.7 million years old, they are attributed to Australopithecus afarensis because humans are not thought by evolutionists to have existed yet. This has been used to support the claim that Australopithecus walked upright like humans. The adult was quite short at 4 feet tall, short but within the low range of human norms. The footprints themselves are totally consistent with the prints of a habitually unshod human foot. In fact, the only reason for not concluding that these are human footprints are the evolutionary presuppositions that blind evolutionists to it. This has led to reconstructions of Lucy and Australopithecus in general as walking upright with an ape-like head and a rather hairy human-like body and, of course, human-like feet. They even included whites in the eyes and a thoughtful gaze, despite the fact that apes have black eyes and not white eyes. This is all done for propaganda purposes and is based completely on evolutionary assumptions. Now, it needs to be noted that having an upright walking ape is no problem for creation science, since there are other reasons, such as genetics, why humans could not have evolved from an ape-like ancestor. However, evolutionists desperately need Australopithecus to walk upright to have a non-human source for the Liatolai footprints. Lucy's leg bone is often shown at the same angle as a human leg bone. This makes great propaganda since it makes Australopithecus afarensis look more human. However, when the top of Lucy's leg is aligned with the top of a human leg, the joints do not match up, suggesting that Lucy's leg had a different angle. When this correction is made, the angle is more in tune with the angle of a chimp rather than the angle of a human leg. However, It is also a perfect match to the leg of a chimpanzee, which has no carrying angle. The fact that Lucy's femur does not line up with a human femur goes against the idea that Australopithecus was a human ancestor and that they walked upright like a human. Here is a comparison between Lucy's finger, a human finger, and the finger of a chimpanzee. As you can see, Lucy's finger does not match a human finger, but is more curved. However, it is a good match to the curvature of the chimpanzee finger. This shows that the curvature of Australopithecus fingers and toes closely resembles that of chimps and other apes. Along with the fact that Australopithecus wrists locked, this evidence suggests that they were tree-dwelling apes and not human ancestors. Here is an illustration of how Lucy died based on the condition of the fossils. Yes, she fell out of a tree. Little foot, with the species label of Australopithecus afarensis, is the most complete Australopithecus ever found, and it tells us a lot about these animals that could not be learned from less complete specimens. Little foot, as the nickname implies, actually had foot bones, and it answers the question as to what type of foot Australopithecus really had. Now, studies of the feet of Australopithecus not only show that they had an ape-like big toe, but that it was fully designed for dwelling in trees. Furthermore, they could not have made the Lee Toley footprints, which were made by a human-like foot and not an ape-like foot. Conclusion: the Lee Toley footprints had to have been made by a human being. The conclusion on Australopithecus is that they walked more upright than extant apes, but they still dwelt in trees. Both their hands and feet were clearly meant for grasping, but they could grasp upper and lower branches independently while walking on the limbs. This also made walking bipedally on the ground easier than found in extant apes, but it still would have been more of a back-and-forth type of walk rather than one similar to a human being. Homo Habilis means handyman, based on what is thought to be stone tools also found at Oldaway Gorge. Homo Habilis had a cranial capacity of 500 to 800 cubic centimeters. However, the placement in genus Homo, human, has been questioned even by evolutionists. Homo habilis most likely should belong to Australopithecus. The features of the skull, from eye sockets, the facial slant, and lack of protruding and internal nasal bones, make it too ape-like to belong to the genus Homo. There is no evidence that these alleged tools were found with actual habilis fossils, but were simply found in the area, such that it is not clear if they actually belong to them. Also, looking at these so-called stone tools, it is doubtful that they are even artificial constructs, but they look like they could just be natural rocks. So, Homo habilis had a cranial capacity of 500 to 800 cubic centimeters, the low end of which is consistent with larger cranial capacities from established Australopithecus of 530 cubic centimeters. Also, the fragmented nature of habilis fossils makes correlating body and brain size impossible. However, it is the ape-like facial features that give habilis away as being an ape and part of Australopithecus. Homo erectus had a flat human face with both internal and external nasal bones, though they had a below-average cranial capacity. They had a cranial capacity of 750 to 1,225 cubic centimeters, with an upper range within that of living human beings. They had averaged 900 cubic centimeters, which is just short of the 950 cubic centimeters lower limit of living humans. But the smallest cranial capacity of 750 cubic centimeters is more than twice that of a human newborn at 369 cubic centimeters. This is the Homo erectus skeleton known as Turkana Boy or KNMWT 15,000. This fairly complete skeleton of this estimated 8 to 9-year-old boy shows they were clearly human with a height of 5 feet, 3 inches. He was well within human norms and probably would have been 6 foot as an adult. Having been found in Africa, Asia, and Europe, Homo erectus used fire and stone tools. This facial reconstruction shows they were quite human. The fact is that Homo erectus was just one of several now apparently extinct branches of mankind that came out of Babel. Homo Heidelbergensis, while claimed as a human ancestor, is clearly just a variety of human beings. A prime piece of evidence is that they had an average cranial capacity of 1,220 cubic centimeters, which is well within the range of living humans. There's also evidence of a broken but internal nasal bone. Homo Heidelbergensis also has a definite nose ridge bone, as shown in this picture. Furthermore, Homo Heidelbergensis shows the unslanted face of a human being. This skull also shows evidence of surgery in the form of a small hole, probably made to relieve internal pressure. Here is an honest facial reconstruction of Homo Heidelbergensis, revealing a clearly human face. There can be no question that Homo Heidelbergensis was simply a variety of human beings and not an evolutionary ancestor. Homo Floresiensis, known as the Hobbit, was a group of small skeletons found on the island of Flores off the coast of Indonesia. They are quite short with appropriately smaller skulls, at about 3.5 feet high. Their proportions fit those of human beings, just smaller than normal. All indications are that these were simply a very small family of the human race. This is a comparison of a hobbit skull and a normal human skull. The hobbit skull has the internal nasal bone that is typical of humans. Homo floresiensis is clearly a small variety of human beings, showing how much variety arose in the post-Babel dispersion. Neanderthals are what most people think of when they think of cavemen. However, they have suffered much from evolutionary presupposition and reconstruction. They had flat faces with internal and external nasal bones, showing that they were quite human. In fact, they even had a larger skull capacity than we do. This facial reconstruction of a Neanderthal shows a very human face and possibly a sample of an isolated post-Babel group of humans. There are also genetic markers that indicate interbreeding with those labeled Homo sapiens, showing clearly that they were human beings. This is all based on reconstructions and descriptions by evolutionists. Unfortunately, creationists seldom get free access to major fossils. However, a creationist, Dr. Jack Quatso, did get such access to some ancient human skulls to photograph and x-ray them, taking full advantage of the opportunity to study these skulls. Quatso published his results, and which can be found in his book, Buried Alive, published in 1998. He found that in some cases the jaw joint was placed unnaturally forward, making the face look more ape-like. Furthermore, he found that placing the jaw in its natural position makes the face look more human. He also found evidence that the rate at which this child matured was way slower than modern norms. This is supported by strong evidence showing that the rate at which children mature has actually decreased over the last couple of hundred years. Not only does the evidence show that ancient man matured more slowly than we do today, but also the shape of Neanderthal skulls is consistent with the face growing and filling out as one gets older. Quatso's measurements show them consistent with the skulls of people who lived for hundreds of years as described in the Bible. So not only are Neanderthals clearly human, but they show evidence of the long lives described in the Bible. It should not be too surprising to find men living in caves during the post-Babel dispersion. When you're on the move away from civilization, caves make good places to seek shelter from the weather and predators. A cave would naturally be a temporary place to stay when there is no nearby civilization, and you have not found a place to settle down. A cave would also be a convenient place to live while you are building in a place you choose to settle down in. The point is that living in caves is not a sign of primitives coming up from being animals, but men who have gotten away from civilization for one reason or another. The Bible tells of David taking refuge in a cave while on the run from King Saul. If humans evolved from a common ancestor with apes, we should expect to see a fairly smooth progression from ape to human. Evolutionists produce the illusion of this by making some groups of humans look more ape-like and some apes look more human-like. They have even classified some apes as genus Homo to complete the illusion of a smooth progression. However, this illusion does not stand up to close scrutiny. The more human-like apes, Australopithecus, can be shown to be just as ape-like as chimpanzees, Those features that make them seem more human-like are actually exaggerated because of evolutionary presupposition. Their linchpin species, Homo Habilis, should be classified as Australopithecus, not Homo, because it was an ape. The rest of the genus Homo are clearly human beings, and not ape men, with most of them suffering from degrees of evolutionary presumption. You will sometimes see a chart like this. It is intended to demonstrate an increase in skull size over time. Now, the original paper does not include any information on where these fossils were found. They do not include how much of the skull was found. This is important because a lot of them are actually small fragments. Most importantly, they do not indicate how the dates are derived. It is therefore quite likely that this chart is likely to largely result from evolutionary presupposition. Now, this is what evolutionists want you to see when you look at this chart: a nice, smooth progression in skull size with time. The first section consists entirely of Australopithecus afarensis and africanus. The second group consists entirely of Australopithecus robustus in borealis and Homo habilis, further supporting the idea that Homo habilis is actually an Australopithecus. The third batch consists entirely of the genus Homo, including Homo erectus, Neanderthals, and modern humans. This group consists entirely of human beings. Now, even if you look at these charts representing relative ages, you still have to understand that interpreting this data from a young Earth creation perspective means that this is the order in which these specimens died, not when they were born. This means, particularly for the genus Homo, that those individuals with the smaller brain sizes actually have shorter lives for one reason or another. All of the evidence claimed for evolution falls under one or more of the following three categories. 1. Assumes evolution and common descent. 2. Assumes only totally natural causes, that is, it excludes God or other intelligence. 3. Assumes that an independent origin would be random. Evidence claimed for transitions tends to be fragmented, with evolutionary presuppositions filling in the blanks. With humans, we have ape and human fossils with no real connection between them. Meanwhile, some apes are made to look more human, and some humans are made to look more like apes based on evolutionary assumptions. When hearing of claimed evolutionary evidence, do not take the reporting or lecturing at face value. Always try to find the original papers and at least pictures of original evidence when possible, because the actual evidence and original papers are never as good as the hype reported around it. Put another way, nothing totally destroys a good evolutionary argument like the original paper and original evidence.